and you'll be quizzed on this material on February 8th, which is next Thursday. I'll also post an outline of my lecture on Thursday and what I'm discussing today. Not only this little podcast, but other information that will be make a complete lecture. So real briefly, in the 1930s, the U.S. was public opinion, very isolationist. Uh, Overwhelmingly, Americans did not want to get involved in a war in Europe, much less Asia. And as I've said many times, there was this feeling that World War I had been oversold, that bankers and industrialists had tricked Americans into the war, and Americans felt like they weren't going to get fooled again. The one person that is not isolationist is Franklin Roosevelt, who's president. He sees Hitler as an enormous threat to U.S. interests, I think correctly. But he has to be quite secretive about his feelings about Hitler, and he's pretty much convinced the U.S. is eventually going to have to go to war against Hitler. I wouldn't say Roosevelt's a warmonger. I think that's completely unfair. Others might disagree. He just saw Hitler as a big threat to the national security interests of the United States, but he can't be too open about it because of public opinion, and he wants to run for a third term in 1940, which he does. And if he had full out said, hey, Hitler's a problem, we're going to have to go to war with him, he would not have been reelected in 1940. So you have these series of neutrality acts that are passed in the 1930s, especially the cash and carry. Belligerents such as Great Britain had to pay cash on the barrelhead if it wanted to buy weapons from the United States. And this was an attempt to learn from the mistakes of World War I. So Roosevelt has to maneuver around these laws, these isolationist laws that are passed by the Congress in the 1930s. The United States, the military, public opinion does get concerned, especially after the fall of France in June of 1940. That's seen as a wake-up call. But so we have a conscription act for the first time. Young men have to sign up for the draft. But Roosevelt, the way he couches these defensive measures or these measures, including his willingness to let the Navy escort British vessels all the way to Iceland because German U-boats are sinking them, he couches these actions as defensive actions, that the U.S. has to defend itself. And he's not talking about a war. And he can't really be super aggressive until after he wins the election of 1940, which he does. In December 1940, he's won the election. He can start to maneuver. And that's when he comes up with the Lend-Lease Acts. Very, very significant. You will be quizzed on what those are. And note again that over 60% of the supplies of Great Britain came from the US, 22% of the supplies the Soviet Union utilized during World War II came to the United States. So the US becomes an arsenal of democracy, and how Roosevelt sells this is, and how he gets around the neutrality acts. He says, look, we're lending this war material to our allies. We're not selling it to our allies. And of course, this was he was being disingenuous because he really didn't expect to get paid back. But again, he's got to work around the neutrality acts and also the opposition to getting involved in the war among Americans, really, which lasted until the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th. And in the next week or so, I'll talk about Hitler's big mistake, which was declaring war on us after Pearl Harbor. He should have never done that. It's unclear if the U.S., if Roosevelt would have been able to persuade the U.S. to go to war against Hitler if Hitler had not declared war on us. But thank God Hitler did something really stupid and declared war on the U.S. And I'll talk about that more in an upcoming podcast. So the leading isolationist in the U.S. is Charles Lindbergh. He goes around during the presidential election and even afterwards into 1941, saying it's the who's leading us into war. It's the British, it's the Roosevelt administration, but it's also the Jews. Um, uh, Roosevelt was convinced that Lindbergh was anti-Semitic. Lindbergh would deny it. But when you hear things like Lindbergh saying Jews are the Jewish population of the US poses a danger because of their ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, and our radio and government. Uh, that's pretty intense rhetoric on the part of Lindbergh. So this is where we're at. We haven't gone to war yet. The United States is not involved with the war, even though it's going full bore in Europe. And this week, it's going to go even more full bore with Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941. But that's not even enough to get the U.S. involved into war. In fact, that's when Lindbergh is going around making some of his most outlandish speeches. And he's not a marginal figure, Lindbergh. He's the most popular man in America, arguably, the most admired person anyway. But so anyway, so he's got a big voice, and isolationists in the U.S. They had a significant voice. They were not marginal. They controlled the Chicago Tribune was a major U.S. Newspaper in the Midwest. It was very isolationist. It hated Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So there were real voices arguing against involvement in the World War II in Europe, and they were quite influential, and they really reflected public opinion in the United States. And Roosevelt, very quietly, very secretly, just keeps chipping away.